Hello and welcome back to Fighters Flow. Today we are doing mental health matters. So today's video is really about like my understanding of mental health, kind of where I have gotten a lot of my perspectives from growing up, how I'm sort of like seeing / feeling it now, and like how I'm navigating that. I thought the best way for me to go about having this conversation was through like a question and answer thing. What does mental health mean to me / how would I define it? Right, a state of being in which I as a person navigate and process my emotions, my energy, my physical body through the lens of my mind. What did it feel like growing up dealing with mental health? Okay, so growing up, I honestly felt really stuck. I just remember being really angry most of the time and like happy. It was kind of like really angry, really happy, and stuck. Yeah. What were some of the things that affected my relationship to my mental health in an unhealthy way when I was younger? I had a lot of unaware trauma that I was experiencing as a child. Because I came to Australia when I was 2 turning 3, so I was pretty young when I was even having to like grow up in the refugee camps. Things that I can't necessarily consciously bring up, but I knew that like, I'd have dreams about like really scary scenarios, and then realizing like as an adult that like, oh no, what you were experiencing wasn't just a dream, like it was like an actual reality. And knowing that a lot of that fear and insecurity also was a relation to like my insecure attachment that I had, because I had a lot of trauma around that with my mother. I had a lot of unprocessed grief as well around losing my middle sister, who wasn't able to make the journey with us coming to Australia. Grief is a really tricky topic to talk about because different cultures celebrate it or acknowledge it or mourn in different ways, but I always felt like it was something that I could never really talk about. My relationship to like my blackness being in Australia, like the built up experiences that I'd had with people around me that had made me feel like I just didn't belong, both like physically in my body and like just socially, being bullied for being different because I grew up having like a bold like buzz cut. And I love my buzz cut. My buzz cut is amazing. How was mental health understood in your family, and like how was it dealt with? For my family unit, we didn't understand mental health, like at all. A language around emotions, language around like feelings, language around self-awareness and trauma and all this kind of stuff. You kind of sound almost really silly thinking about it, because you're like, no, like we're human beings and we have emotions, we have feelings, we are not robots. But how is that all understood? How do we translate that for us in our own community, coming from the cultures that we come from? And I realized that, like when I like looked back, that we did have moments where we expressed feelings and frustrations and burdens. Like in my language, we have a word called mafkirio, which is like, it's like translated as like having lots of thoughts, like lots of thinking, and sometimes it can have connotations of like feeling stressed or worried or anxious or just feeling like burdened by whatever it is that is on your mind. And that is real. But in terms of then widening that conversation to talk about it in like this Western society, and like how much more that requires from us to be able to translate that in terms of the place that we're living in, it gets tricky. And so when I was young and I would communicate things around feeling unseen or feeling unheard or requiring more communication from like my mom, or like more understanding and empathy from like my siblings or like my cousins, I would always be mocked for it. You know, I would always be seen as like being like too white, or, you know, like, which they would say like, oh, you're such a Muzungu, like, oh my God, like, you know, you're not African, you're not black, you know, the way that you're talking right now doesn't resemble who we are. But I think that was only a reflection of their incapacity to be able to acknowledge their own emotions, but also not feeling like they knew how to navigate their own emotions like in this Western context, if that makes any sense. I think the motto was pretty much like, you know, stay silent and be strong, because, you know, we're all warriors. You know, Africans are warriors. What are some of the cultural differences about dealing with mental health in Africa versus Australia? From what I have been able to gather, the West is highly individualistic. At least that's how I see its approach societally. Physically, like when you are sitting in houses, like the walls are so high, the fences. I think people are very self-interested here in the West, and I think that that does limit, you know, your capacity to be able to share and support and provide some level of like kinship within your community, especially, you know, not just like when things are really hard, like, you know, going through a global pandemic. Like, I mean, just in general, I feel like things are very much more isolating in the West than compared to back home. Technology wise, that's played a really big part in how connected we feel to each other physically. Like, I know that we have been able to expand in such a way that we haven't been like ever. Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, literally YouTube. It's such a new way for us to be more engaged with each other, but it is very much so in a digital way and not in a physical way. And so I think that those attributes have impacted how we are connected to one another. So there is a lot more isolation and loneliness. A lot of that sort of like self-interested mentality that I find that exists in the West, I think has transferred quite a lot into, I guess, how we deal with well-being and like health. Because I think that people are sort of more, I guess, to a degree, taught to rely on themselves. But I do think that they're trying to make, you know, strides towards being a more community conscious based society when dealing with mental health and slash health and well-being. So Africa, like in terms of like my people, like we come from the village. You know, we don't come from like really wealthy families. We don't like come from the city. Yeah, we grew up in the village, and so my understanding of what I know and what we have access to back home comes from that perspective. Collectively, it feels as though we have more of an emphasis on community in terms of knowing what is around you, in terms of support. You know, you can go to your neighbor. You know, you can go to your family. When I went back home when I was 9, what I remember, because Africa has changed, at least like Uganda, Kakira, which is the town that I grew up in with my family, my immediate family, houses were not that tall. I could literally sit at the front of my grandfather's compound and be able to see like literally my neighborhood, and know that I could literally just sit at the front and have a conversation with that neighbor and that neighbor and that neighbor and that neighbor. And so feelings of isolation weren't really real in a physical sense. Literally surrounded by abundance. Like my grandfather had this ginormous fene tree, which is jackfruit tree, and to the left, the biggest avocado tree I have ever seen. He had this papaya tree at the front here, and literally, like, if you walk to like the back of his house, you could walk down to the samba, which is like massive lawn. You've got a massive lake on the side. You've got kids playing soccer. You know, you've got people just sitting around like eating sugarcane, being able to walk down to the market, you know. And yes, like the streets were pretty dirty, and you'd get it stuck in between your toes all the time, and you had to wash your feet all the time. And yeah, like it smelled like charcoal sometimes, you know, and oil, and you know, the conditions weren't great, but it was wonderful. And I think also not having such an immense like surrounding of technology was also another thing. People could be present, and you know, there are other ways in which, other than like having systems structured around, you know, going to a medical professional, you could go to church and pray. You could, you know, dance in your space, in your home, with your family, your people. You can just sit down together and gather and talk about your family, your stories, your history. In saying that, even within the aspect of having like a collective community-based approach to, I guess, supporting each other spiritually, culturally, we still lack a lot of, I guess, depth and I guess understanding around being able to talk about mental health in a way that does center the individual, makes room for us to be able to explore other means of being able to access support. And I really need to emphasize that we do have psychologists, we do have therapists and counselors and mental health practitioners in Africa, but again, people who have access to those are usually from a much more wealthier economical status. And in terms of like their availability, like how many are there to be able to access, that again depends on your proximity to wealth and your ability to be able to know who they are and what they do, and know what you would need them for. So privilege is a really important thing, and I think going back to like growing up here, that's something that I've been able to unpack and be able to know that I'm able to have because I've grown up here in the West. What has changed about my perceptions on mental health over the years? Emotional sustainability is environmental sustainability because nature is source. Mental health is a human experience. It is not a white experience. It is literally something that everyone experiences because we are human beings. It's a thing that I definitely know exists on both sides. Like that argument, like whenever I've been around like my white peers or like even growing up in school, I always saw that it was something that was never applied to us black kids. Like we never experienced things that were relatable to other students because we weren't other students. And when other students who were white experienced that, it was always very much so met with support and understanding. And then on my African side of things, it's that conversation of I'm black to, you know, be so emotional. It's so un-African to talk about your feelings. Like you're so white for even bringing that up in that way. Yeah, mental health matters. It really does. We're all human beings just trying to be, you know, alive. We can have conversations in a way that helps us acknowledge that it is just as important as anything else. So thank you for watching. I look forward to our next video together. And yeah, take it easy and remember to, you know, look after your mental health because it matters. Bye.